Hi, I'm Dr. Chris Errol, and welcome to the MOL-BIO podcast. And this episode is called Life is Strange. Why is the natural world so weird? For the article, I focused on examples from our own biology as humans of the weirdness and the strangeness of the natural world. But arguably, there are even more absurd examples I could have taken from other organisms. For example, my work in a microbiology lab for the last 7 years focused on what's called a type 6 secretion system. Don't worry about the cumbersome name. It's basically like this needle that sticks out of the surface of a bacterial cell, and it injects nearby bacteria to kill them. It injects them with this needle with a whole load of toxins. Very cool. But when we look at the structure of this needle, it looks like it's basically a virus. And it's a virus that has been co-opted for this other purpose altogether. It's a virus that infects bacteria normally, which it might be a surprise to some people too, that bacteria can get sick in some way, if that's even the right word. But yeah, so bacteria can contract viruses, and these viruses inject their DNA through this needle-like structure inside the bacterial cell, and that's how they exert their effects to take over the machinery and ultimately lyse the cells in many cases, and burst them open, that is, and kill them. But somehow these virus genes have ended up on the bacteria's own genome, on its own DNA, and has now adopted this whole other function, which is to, instead of injecting genetic material, is now injecting protein toxins to kill nearby cells. So that's one example. Another could be if you look at the Earth from space. It's blue and green. A lot of the land appears green from space in the continents. We all know that. But isn't it quite unbelievable to think that the reason that it's coloured green is because of the evolution of land plants, grasses, trees, flowering plants, all of that. And why is it green? Well, the reason it's green is because years and years ago, once free-living cyanobacterial cell got inside another cell, a process we called endosymbiosis. And because cyanobacteria are able to convert sunlight into sugars, and they do this through photosynthesis, which requires a green pigment, chlorophyll. So yeah, the planet is green and blue, but the reason it's green and blue is because of this really unbelievable relationship between this cyanobacteria, which got inside what we would call a eukaryotic cell. And this gave rise to all of the world's land plants. Truly incredible. Really, really remarkable. But anyway, that's just two examples of the wonder of the natural world. In the article, I actually talk a little bit about evolution, talk about gradual change. But these types of symbiosis events have always kind of had an awkward place within the Darwinist evolutionary framework. And that's going to be the subject of a future article where we think about how these landmark events in the history of life. So our framework for thinking about how organisms evolve and have the complexity that they have needs some sort of accommodation of those types of events. And I think there's been some really interesting work done on that recently. So in this article, I will talk about another example of a symbiotic relationship, one much closer to home. The article picture, I wanted to find something weird to capture the sentiment of the article. And this photo came out very unusual. Everything's distorted and blurred, and it's taken down a street in Amsterdam, and the neon signs are all squiggly. It's a very cool effect. I really liked it. After being taken many years ago, it's found a home in this article. So thank you to Aaron Kenny for taking that. Okay, without further ado, here it is. It's been almost 100 years since the scientist J.B.S. Haldane proclaimed that the universe is not only queerer than we suppose, but queerer than we can suppose. In other words, he believed that as we continued to understand the true nature of existence, it would surpass anything we could dare to imagine. Well, now with the hindsight of an additional century of scientific discovery, we can safely say he was absolutely correct. Life has turned out to be so much more absurd than anyone could have predicted. As a molecular biologist, I've read countless stories about the weirdness of living things in the natural world. Life is truly absurd. It's surprising. It's obscure. But why is life so strange? For a long time, I didn't know what to make of it, but now I have the answer I was looking for. In this article, I'll give you my exploration of the truly bizarre world that we emerged from, that we are part of, and now I've come to terms with the absurdity of life. Humans are part of the natural world. When Charles Darwin's theory of evolution was presented to the world in 1859, there was outrage at the idea that humans are on the ape branch of the tree of life. One of Darwin's supporters, Thomas Henry Huxley, and the brilliantly named Samuel Wilberforce, the Bishop of Oxford, were on opposite sides of what became known as the Great Oxford Debate in 1860. Wilberforce asked Huxley, was it through his grandfather or his grandmother that he claimed his descent from a monkey? And equally entertaining was Huxley's response that he would prefer an ape as an ancestor over a man like Wilberforce, one, and this is a quote, endowed by nature and possessed of great means and influence, who employs these faculties for the mere purpose of introducing ridicule into a grave scientific discussion, with all the pomp and carnival of Victorian debate. Of course, no one's grandfather or grandmother is a monkey, unless you are a monkey. But the truth is almost as absurd. If you had a photograph of every one of your ancestors going back in time, you would eventually reach a life form that more closely resembles our modern-day apes, such as chimpanzees and bonobos, than a human. But that would require photographs going back a few million years. You see, Wilberforce was overlooking what is possible given enough time and gradual change. That's partly why it took so long for an acceptable theory of evolutionary change to be put together. We were only just beginning in Victorian Britain to appreciate the vastness of deep geological timescales. It was becoming clear that the Earth is many millions of years old rather than thousands, and it wasn't until the 1950s that we got our first really accurate dating, which put the Earth at 4.54 billion years old. And if we show that number with all the zeros, it looks like this. That's 4540 years old. 4,540 million years old, which is 4.5 billion. The truth is even more peculiar. If we were to continue going back in time, visiting more of our ancestors, we would see that tens of millions of years ago, during the time of the dinosaurs, our ancestors were likely nocturnal, shrew-like animals. Further back still, we'd meet the fish-like amphibian that was developing adaptations that would allow it to move out of the water and onto land. And that's the ancestor of all amphibians, reptiles, and mammals. Go back even further, and we meet the single-celled eukaryotes. All the complex organisms you see today are what we called eukaryotic. That is, they are made up of a particular type of cell. We are multicellular conglomerations of eukaryotic cells, many trillions of them. But some eukaryotic organisms still exist or can exist as single cells. But we can go back even further. Before the eukaryotic cell, there were prokaryotes, and prokaryotes include bacteria and the final domain of life, the archaea. So this gives us the three domains of life: bacteria, archaea, and eukarya. And this only became clear in the early 1970s thanks to the work of Carl Woese and many others who were involved in that. So prokaryotes, which is, remember, that's your bacteria and archaea, they have simpler, smaller cells than eukaryotes. Our cells are complex and big. And I've put a figure together which I've tried to put all of these biological events into the context of the history of the universe. It's hard to describe this figure with words. Easier if you look at the original article, which is I'll always link somewhere for you to find easily. So in the top half of the figure, I have a timeline, the history of the universe, which is about 13.8 billion years from the Big Bang to the present day. But if we look at just the origins of our solar system, Earth, the Sun, that's about 4.6 billion years old or something like that. The Earth, 4.54 billion years old. And we can see that, we're not sure exactly about this, but the more we think about it, we think that life started reasonably quickly on Earth. As soon as conditions became permissible, it seems that from our calculations, it seems that life happened pretty quickly, but it was simple life, bacteria and archaea, the prokaryotic cells. And it remained that way for a long, long time before the complex cells, the eukaryotes, start to arrive on the scene. And it takes even longer before the complex eukaryotic cells start to form the plants and the animals that we know today. In fact, plant and animal diversity probably only really explodes 500 million years ago. So this isn't that long in the grand scheme of things. And if you think about humans, we've been here only about 300,000 years. So we're newcomers to the cosmic stage. Let's think a bit more about eukaryotic cells. And this is where things start to get weird. The eukaryotic cell that makes us up contains mitochondria, which are the powerhouse of the cell, as you may remember from school. The mitochondria were once free-living bacteria, which is thought to have found itself in a symbiotic relationship, living inside an archaeal cell of some type. So there you have it. You're not just an ape. You are the descendant of a cell type which was created by the fusion of two different forms of microbial life, the prokaryotes, and that was a bacterial partner that got inside an archaeal cell. And we could do a whole article about the wonders of mitochondria. They carry out aerobic respiration. In other words, they are a large part of the reason that we use oxygen. They use it to produce huge amounts of ATP, the energy currency of the cell. And this was all found out relatively recently, thanks to the work and advocacy of Lynn Margulis in the 1960s. And it was confirmed by molecular analysis in the 1970s. We know that all life is interrelated because it all uses the same or extremely similar genetic machinery. The same inherited information, DNA, which is transcribed to RNA before being translated to produce proteins. So that scheme, DNA to RNA to protein, is found in all living things on Earth. And remember, proteins, that sort of final stage in that pathway, are the molecules which do most of the work in the cell, including building cellular structures and membranes. So whether you are a bacterium, an archaeon, or a eukaryote, you have inherited this system for being alive. This is why a professor of microbiology, who was one of my undergraduate lecturers, described us and all complex life as some sort of elaborate microbes. And one of the things that I didn't say in the article, which is fascinating again, is if we look at some of the genes that you have today that carry out really important functions, we can see that they're shared between us and bacteria or between us and archaea. And that's a really unbelievable thing to get our head around, that we still share a large part of our genetic stuff with these microbes. But it gets even weirder. It's estimated that as much as 8% of our human genome is made up of something called endogenous retroviral elements. These are a type of virus that managed to get into the germline of our lineage over the years. The most famous or infamous example of a retrovirus is HIV. And these viruses integrate a DNA copy of their genome into our own DNA. So if this happens in the cells of your body, it can cause a disease. The infection may be cured depending on the virus. But when it happens in the germline, it ends up being inherited by your descendants. And so this has happened multiple times over the years in our ancestry. And that's why there's such an abundance of these elements still within us. Most of them aren't particularly functional, but what is weird is that there's something called syncytin-1, and it's a protein that plays an important role in cell fusion during human placental development. The gene encoding this protein is part of one of these endogenous retroviral elements. In other words, it is derived from an ancient endogenous viral infection, but has acquired a new biological role within us. Another little thing that's not in the article, these sequences, these things that used to be viruses that are just integrated into our DNA, most of them are just kind of silent. But what happens is the expression of these genes, which means turning them into RNA and proteins, which can then do functional things within a cell. When you are undergoing disease or some sort of dysfunction like cancer development, then we see a lot of these endogenous retroviral sequences starting to be expressed. And sometimes this is a bad thing for the pathology of the disease. So we're interested in them for a number of really important health and medical reasons too. Okay, how do we make sense of all of this? Science explores the gap between perception and reality. In order for science to make these advances and insights, it required new technologies, or at the least, new ways of looking at the natural world. The fact that all life is cellular in nature first required the enhancement of our visual capacities. Single-celled organisms are too small to see with the naked eye. And it was thanks to developments in lens technologies and the development of higher-powered microscopes that we could appreciate their existence. The Dutch scientist Antony van Leeuwenhoek was the pioneer here, as well as Robert Hooke in England. Leeuwenhoek observed what he called animalcules in pond water, which were single-celled organisms. It took a couple of centuries for us to start to appreciate that all life, including ourselves, is cellular in nature. This is at least as absurd as Darwin's findings. But why is the natural world and life so weird? Here we need to take a step back. Absurdity, peculiarity, obscurity, all of these words appropriately describe the surprisingly weird nature of life. The reason life appears absurd is that it is deeply unfamiliar to our everyday experience of being human. Evolution has endowed us with our sense of vision, taste, smell, touch, and hearing, which are then integrated by our central nervous system to create a model of reality, which allows us to survive, find food, escape danger, and find mates. In his book, The Case Against Reality, How Evolution Hid the Truth from Our Eyes, author Donald D. Hoffman argues that our perception of the world is not an accurate recapitulation of reality, and in some cases is wildly wrong. This is why life feels absurd. Science, by augmenting our sense of sight, reveals a world of microscopic cells we could not have anticipated. But it is not always technology driven. It often is, though. It can be conceptual too. Charles Darwin wasn't the first evolutionist, but he gave the first widely accepted theory of how organisms change over time. And that's the key word here, time. The Scottish geologist Charles Lyell had shown that the timescales we are dealing with are so vast as to be beyond human comprehension, which meant that gradual change could result in massive changes over such timescales. And it took the development of radiometric dating for us to get the first accurate assessment of Earth's age 100 years later in the 1950s. To take another example, by 1953, developments in X-ray crystallography and electron microscopy gave biologists access to the world of atoms and molecules. Light microscopy, like the type used by Leeuwenhoek, has limited resolution due to the wavelength of light. But both electrons and X-rays have shorter wavelengths than light, which means even greater magnification and resolution. Now we could probe the subcellular environment. We could go inside the cell, as it were, and examine specific molecules such as DNA and proteins. This was what ignited the molecular revolution in biology and ultimately led us to fully decipher the genetic code and how it relates to RNA and protein, and later to the realization that all living organisms on Earth use that similar system. Finally, it was only because of developments in sequencing technologies that allow us to read whole genomes that led us to appreciate the great number of viral sequences in our genome, which I mentioned before. Absurdism. In coming to terms with the weirdness of the natural world, I was drawn towards philosophy and the idea of the absurd for answers. Absurdity has a specific meaning in existential philosophy. It was a term that had been around for a long time, but underwent a resurgence with the work of writer Albert Camus and his 1942 book, The Myth of Sisyphus. In short, the absurd, as Camus specifically called it, is the conflict between humans as conscious entities and the rationalistic understanding of reality that has emerged from our modern scientific knowledge. Camus was thinking about the meaning or lack of meaning in human existence. I'm not discussing that so much here, but I have discussed that previously, and I've written an article called The Illusion of Meaning, loads of videos on YouTube on that, conversations and short videos, medium-length videos. So check any of those out. Here I am invoking absurdity in a way similar to Buddhist philosophy, which describes how our conscious awareness can sometimes obscure the true nature of reality. In Buddhism, the word dukkha describes approximately, is a complex translation to try and decide how in English we should think about that word, but it roughly can be thought of as suffering or friction, specifically the discontent we feel when our expectations of reality are not congruent with its true nature. For example, the denial of our own mortality is a source of dukkha. We can add to this Hoffman's perspective from The Case Against Reality, that evolution doesn't necessarily endow us with sensory and nervous systems that authentically capture the world. Through scientific and technological interventions, we can reveal whole new layers of reality that were previously inaccessible to our evolved senses. In other words, that is why Camus' sense of the absurdity of the human predicament was so urgently distressing, so dissonant. is because science narrows the gap between our perceptions and reality, and in doing so shatters our expectations and illusions. By Camus' time in the 1940s, the scientific revolution, which began in the 1500s, had been churning long enough to dispel many of our deepest held illusions. The privileged place of humanity as separate from the natural world had long become untenable. Quantum mechanics, the great absurdity. So I made a few short videos and posted them on TikTok and Instagram and YouTube Shorts, places like that, about my favourite examples of the absurdity of the natural world. And I asked people, to do one better. What's a better example of absurdity than the ones I gave about the viruses, about the mitochondria and all that? And the one that came up the most by far, which we might think of as the ultimate or the greatest absurdity of all, was quantum mechanics. Now, I'm not a physicist. I've read popular books about quantum mechanics. I don't understand the mathematical formulations of quantum mechanics. So here is my best attempt at capturing why quantum mechanics is yet more weird than what we've already discussed. So quantum mechanics as a field was just emerging and maturing when Haldane made his queerer than we can suppose prediction. And so no doubt this influenced his appreciation of the bizarre when he wrote that. I've spoken about how, as we have analysed life at the cellular and then the subcellular level of molecules like DNA and proteins, we have found some pretty wild stuff. Well, if we drill down further to the level of atoms and subatomic particles, we find that reality is pretty much incomprehensible, at least to our human minds. So we'll try and think of this in simplistic terms. Atoms are what make up everything we know and love, planets, stars, and living things like us. There are other forms of matter, such as antimatter and dark matter, which probably deserve a mention in an article all about the weird, but we'll save that for another day. Anyway, the atoms we are familiar with have a nucleus containing protons and neutrons, surrounded by electrons. The number of protons and electrons in a particular type of atom conveys its properties and how it interacts with the other types of atoms. This gives an atom its atomic number and is the basis for our periodic table of elements, which most of you will have encountered at some point in school or seen somewhere. Each of those boxes on the table of elements is an atom with a different number. Things like gold, oxygen, hydrogen, helium, lithium, uranium, all loads of different properties. Some on Earth are gases, some are solids, some are radioactive. It's all based on the way the atoms are made up. The reason that is called quantum mechanics is that many physical quantities such as energy, angular momentum, including spin, and in confined systems momentum, can take only discrete quantized values. So this was a bit of a surprise to people, that things would be so quantized that there would be exact values. So when you excite an electron that's surrounding a nucleus, there's a specific amount of energy that will move that electron into a higher energy level around the nucleus. So there's these quanta. Subatomic particles exhibit strange properties, such as wave-particle duality. To summarize a large body of experimental work and mathematical formulations, electrons display both wave-like and particle-like properties, depending on how they are measured. Quantum mechanics describes an electron using a wave function, which spreads out through space and predicts the probability of finding the electron in different locations. When a measurement is then made, the electron is observed at one specific location. In the traditional Copenhagen interpretation, This is described as the wave function collapsing. Now, there's been a lot of pseudoscience built up around that fact, the idea of consciousness interacting with quantum objects, meaning both consciousness and the quantum are fundamental features of reality. Today, most physicists reject the idea that consciousness is required for measurement. Instead, interactions with the surrounding environment rapidly destroy observable quantum properties, a process known as decoherence. So decoherence explains why macroscopic, large objects behave classically. So decoherence is the term we use to explain why these large objects behave normally, because we lose these quantum properties through the interactions. But that by itself does not solve the deeper question of why measurements appear to produce a single definite outcome. That is why, for the most part, we can think of living organisms in classical terms. In other words, behaving normally because the crowded environment of the cell erases the weirdness through a constant bombardment of interactions at the atomic level. It should be noted, though, that there are quantum effects that are important in biological systems, such as in the functioning of enzyme catalytic sites and the process of photosynthesis, which involves the quantum tunneling of electrons, allowing them to traverse energy barriers. The other really weird quantum effect I will mention is quantum entanglement, which Albert Einstein famously called spooky action at a distance. Consider two particles that have become entangled. Their quantum states are correlated. If one is measured to have spin up, the other will be measured to have spin down. In this hypothetical example, conservation laws mean that if one particle is measured to spin up, the other must always be down. Now, even if the particles are separated by billions of miles, measuring one instantly tells you what result would be obtained from measuring the other one if you measured it in the same way. The correlations appear immediately, regardless of distance. Now, exactly how to interpret all this remains one of the deepest questions in quantum physics. Some theoretical physicists argue that our best chance at a unified theory of everything will come from quantum field theory. And quantum field theory combines quantum mechanics with special relativity. Rather than thinking of protons, neutrons, or electrons as particles, quantum field theory views them as perturbations or undulations in an underlying field that permeates our reality. So that's quite an incredible way of seeing things, and it's very alien to us humans. In his book, Physics Fixes All the Facts, Liam Graham argues that the world we perceive could not be more different from its true nature. And this is a quote from his book. Almost everything we think we know about the world is wrong. The sky isn't blue. Nothing is blue. There are no colours. You are not holding a book. There are no books. Instead, there are quantum fields arranged blue-wise or book-wise. These interact with other quantum fields arranged person-wise, and so reconfigure them into a state that corresponds to seeing a blue sky or holding a book. If quantum physics is beyond our imaginative understanding, its implication for ourselves and the universe as a whole will necessarily make no sense to us. So that perspective takes us to the most extreme possibility, that our perception is so grossly misaligned with reality that everything is illusory. But there are still many difficulties for quantum field theory, including its failure to accommodate the force of gravity at present. Regardless of its future success, there is no doubt in my mind that the greatest absurdity we are aware of lies at the quantum level. Final thoughts. Life is not absurd, but quantum mechanics might be. Life isn't absurd or weird. Life just is. Absurdity is not a property of the natural world. It is a description of the friction between my human consciousness and the true nature of reality. Our expectations of reality have evolved for purposes other than scientific research. As we have enhanced our capacity to investigate the world around us, it has revealed us to be very different things from how we might feel as humans. That we are descended from microbes makes scientific sense. Complex life has emerged from more humble beginnings. Greater complexity arose stepwise from lesser complexity. But it still feels ridiculous, or maybe wondrous. The reaction may depend on the person. Personally, I think it's great. That your own cells contain the descendants of once free living bacterial cells in the form of mitochondria has always seemed to me a fantastically wild yet true fact of life. And there has been some very interesting theoretical work on the evolution of these types of symbiotic, mutually beneficial relationships, which helps us understand how they came to be. But I will save those fascinating details for another day. Likewise, given that there are viruses that can insert their genomes into our own, it makes sense that these would turn up when we sequence entire human genomes. If something confers new properties, such as the viral syncytin in one protein, it will be retained by natural selection. As for the 8% of the rest of the genome that has viral sequences, some of them may have biological functions, most will not, but if they aren't actively deleterious before reproductive age, then again they will be kept, or more accurately, not selected against. Finally, quantum mechanics. Given the counterintuitive nature of quantum phenomena, physicists have developed many interpretations of what the mathematics means, giving rise to different schools of thought. Some argue that the apparent weirdness results from our everyday concepts of waves, particles, and reality itself being inadequate for describing the quantum world. Others argue that quantum mechanics reveals something genuinely fundamental about nature, that, at its deepest level, reality does not conform to the classical, sensible picture we might expect. The article ends with lyrics from one of my favourite songs, which captures the absurdity of life. It's called In the Aeroplane Over the Sea by Neutral Milk Hotel. It tells the story of Anne Frank, a young Jewish girl who lived in Amsterdam during the Second World War, while Nazi Germany was invading and systematically targeting Jewish people for destruction. It's unbelievable to think that that happened in our recent past. But the story is it's a beautiful song and a beautiful story that they tell. And here's the lyrics. What a beautiful face I have found in this place that is circling all round the sun. And when we meet on a cloud, I'll be laughing out loud. I'll be laughing with everyone I see. Can't believe how strange it is to be anything at all. Yeah, if you go to the original article, there's a bit more information about the references and my process that I took for discussing the quantum mechanics aspects, which of course is not my wheelhouse. Thanks also to Ursula Goodenough for pointing out that in the original article I said radiocarbon dating to get the age of the Earth. Carbon is not the right radioisotope to use for those types of vast timescales. It was thanks to an understanding of the radio decay of lead, I think it was, by Claire Patterson and I think a Russian scientist too, that gave us the first accurate age of the Earth, and also led us to understand that the entire Earth was being polluted through industrial processes that was releasing neurotoxic lead into our environment, and we're breathing it in, and it's everywhere where it shouldn't be. And it's extremely toxic. So Claire Patterson's a bit of a hero of mine scientifically, but also environmentally too, because his work was eventually used to get lead removed from petrol. So thankfully we don't have petrol lead fumes in our immediate vicinity to the level we used to. Okay, if you've made it this far, you should really be getting paid. But thank you so much for listening. And yeah, always let me know in the comments, let me know anywhere if there's other things you want me to cover, other things you want me to talk about. I've always got loads of stuff that I want to cover, and I've already got a few ideas for the next few episodes in the series, and I'm looking forward to it. So thanks so much for listening. Have a wonderful day. Goodbye.